On the evening of April 14, 1865, as laughter filled Ford's Theater, a single gunshot shattered the air. President Abraham Lincoln, the man who had carried the United States through its Civil War, was struck down by John Wilkes Booth. At just 56, he did not fall on a battlefield, but in a theater box, leaving behind a grieving nation and a legacy that would outlive his mortal frame. Abraham Lincoln's story begins not in the halls of power, but in the rough-hewn silence of the Kentucky frontier. Born in 1809 in a one-room log cabin, he came into a world of poverty, toil, and uncertainty. His father was a farmer of modest means. His mother, a woman whose death when Lincoln was only 9, carved a wound that never fully closed. The cabin had no bookshelves, no tutors, no path that seemed to point toward greatness. And yet, from those meager beginnings, Lincoln carved out his own education. By firelight, with borrowed books and scraps of paper, he taught himself to read and write. The boy who split rails for fences with an axe in hand would later wield words as his greatest weapon. Friends and neighbors remembered him as awkward in stature, tall, lanky, often dressed poorly, but with a mind alive with questions and a heart restless for something greater. Lincoln's path was never smooth. He failed in business, lost elections, and endured the ridicule of rivals who dismissed him as unrefined. But each failure became another plank in the bridge he was building for himself. His resilience, more than his brilliance, defined him. The self-taught farm boy transformed into a lawyer, and from there, a legislator who spoke with an uncommon blend of honesty and clarity. By the time he entered the national stage, Lincoln represented something radical in America. The idea that leadership could rise not from birthright or wealth, but from merit, endurance, and vision. His journey from log cabin to White House was not merely personal, it was symbolic. For millions of ordinary Americans, his story was proof that the Republic's promise was real. And yet, within this rise to power lay the seeds of tragedy. Lincoln would one day lead a fractured nation, a man forged in hardship, destined to face trials greater than any he had known. His story, like the nation's, would be one of struggle, sacrifice, and a relentless march toward a horizon clouded with both hope and blood. When Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States in November 1860, the celebration was muted. The nation was not united behind him, it was splintering. His victory, without a single electoral vote from the South, signaled to slaveholding states that their way of life stood in jeopardy. Within weeks, secession began. South Carolina led the way, followed by others, and by the time Lincoln took the oath of office in March 1861, the Union itself was crumbling. He entered the White House not in triumph, but under the shadow of crisis. Washington, D.C. was a city on edge, with Confederate sympathizers lurking even in its neighborhoods. Rumors of assassination circulated even before his inauguration. To many in the South, Lincoln was not a leader, but a tyrant in waiting, a man determined to strangle their rights. To abolitionists, he was too cautious, too reluctant to strike directly at slavery. To moderates, he was a gamble, untested, unpolished, yet suddenly at the helm of a storm. Lincoln's first year in office was defined by impossible decisions. Fort Sumter fell in April 1861, and with it came the roar of war. The Civil War was not a distant possibility, it was reality. Lincoln called for troops, knowing that every word, every order, would be judged as either salvation or betrayal. He carried not only the weight of the presidency, but the weight of a republic that could collapse at any moment. In speeches, he reached for unity, appealing to the better angels of our nature. But the angels seemed silent as battlefields filled with blood. Lincoln's genius was not in military strategy. He often clashed with generals and doubted his own judgment, but in moral endurance. He held steady when others wavered, believing that the Union must be preserved at any cost. The presidency had never before demanded so much, and never again would it be the same. By the end of his second year in office, it was clear. Lincoln's tenure would be written not in ink, but in fire and blood. He was the president of crisis, and his fate was bound to the outcome of the most devastating war his nation would ever face. By 1863, the Civil War had ground into a stalemate of blood and despair. Thousands lay dead in fields across Virginia and Tennessee. Yet the deeper cause of the conflict, slavery, remained unresolved. Lincoln, once cautious in his approach, reached a turning point. The war was not only about preserving the Union, it had to become a war for freedom. On January 1st, 1863, with a steady hand, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The document was both simple and revolutionary. All enslaved people in Confederate states were declared free. The proclamation did not immediately liberate every man, woman, and child in bondage, but it transformed the moral landscape of the war. What began as a struggle to keep the Union intact now became a battle for human liberty. The reactions were explosive. In the South, hatred for Lincoln hardened into obsession. He was painted as a tyrant, a destroyer of their world. In the North, support was mixed. Abolitionists hailed him as a deliverer, while critics called it reckless, fearing it would prolong the war. Yet among the enslaved themselves, the news spread like fire. Songs, prayers, and whispered hopes took on new meaning. For them, Lincoln's signature was a beacon, a promise that the chains could finally break. Lincoln himself understood the weight of the moment. "If my name ever goes into history," he said, "it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." Those words captured not only the moral courage of the decision, but also the cost. By choosing emancipation, Lincoln guaranteed that he would remain a permanent enemy to those who fought to preserve slavery. The proclamation also reshaped the battlefield. Enlisted black soldiers joined the Union ranks, fighting for a freedom they could now claim as their own. Their presence infused the war with a new sense of justice, strengthening Lincoln's conviction that this cause was worth any sacrifice. From that moment forward, Lincoln was no longer just a president. He was a liberator, a figure whose legacy would stretch far beyond the war. But liberation also sealed his fate, for with every step toward freedom, he drew closer to those who plotted his destruction. By April 1865, the smoke of war began to clear. After 4 years of carnage, the Confederate armies collapsed one after another. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, and the war's end was finally in sight. For Abraham Lincoln, it was the moment he had long prayed for, a chance not only to reunite the nation, but to heal it. Lincoln's vision for peace was radical in its mercy. Unlike those who demanded vengeance against the South, he spoke of malice toward none, with charity for all. In his second inaugural address, delivered only weeks earlier, he had framed the war not as a punishment of the South, but as a shared trial of the entire nation. His words carried the gravity of Scripture, calling Americans to rebuild without bitterness. Hope began to flicker. Freedmen looked to Lincoln as their protector, believing he would ensure their place in the new America. Soldiers returning home saw him as the man who had carried them through the storm. Even weary Northerners, drained by years of loss, glimpsed in Lincoln the possibility of renewal. And yet, beneath this fragile hope, shadows remained. The South was devastated, its fields burned, its economy ruined. Millions of people, formerly enslaved, now free, stood at the threshold of liberty without resources, education, or security. Lincoln knew the task ahead was more daunting than the war itself. To bind wounds, to reconcile enemies, to construct a new society from the ashes of old. Still, in those fleeting April days, he allowed himself to breathe. On April 14th, Good Friday, he told his cabinet that it was the happiest day of his life. That evening, he decided to relax and attend a play at Ford's Theater with his wife, Mary. It was a choice made in relief, in celebration, in the fragile glow of peace. Yet, it was also a step into destiny. For as Lincoln basked in the first light of triumph, forces of hatred and vengeance were already moving in the shadows. Victory was his, but the price of it was written in the dark script of history. John Wilkes Booth was no ordinary assassin. He was a celebrated actor, known for his charisma on stage, but off stage he harbored a burning hatred for Abraham Lincoln. To Booth, Lincoln was not a president, but a usurper, a tyrant who had destroyed the South's way of life. In his mind, Lincoln's death would avenge the Confederacy and perhaps rekindle the flames of Southern resistance. Booth was not alone. He gathered around him a small band of conspirators, men fueled by desperation, anger, and dreams of glory. Their plot extended far beyond a single bullet. They planned a coordinated strike against the very heart of the Union government. Lincoln would die at Ford's Theater. Vice President Andrew Johnson would be killed in his hotel. Secretary of State William Seward, bedridden from an injury, would be slain in his home. With the top of the Union's leadership decapitated in one night, Booth believed chaos would follow, giving the South one last chance. The conspirators met in shadows, whispering their plans in taverns and rented rooms. Booth, ever the dramatist, saw himself as a hero stepping into history's spotlight. He practiced his role with the same intensity he once gave to Shakespeare's tragedies. But this was no play, and his audience would be a grieving nation. On April 11th, Lincoln delivered a speech in which he hinted at granting voting rights to some Black Americans. Booth listened in the crowd and seethed. "That means Ninya Niker citizenship," he hissed to a companion. "Now, by God, I'll put him through." That moment hardened his resolve. The plot would move forward. By April 14th, the night was chosen, the targets marked, and the stage set. Booth polished his pistol, rehearsed his lines, and steeled himself for the act he believed would immortalize him. In truth, it would, though not as the hero he imagined, but as the villain who struck down a nation's leader in cold blood. The night of April 14th, 1865, began with relief. The Civil War was over, spring had returned, and Washington buzzed with celebration. Abraham Lincoln, exhausted by years of war, finally allowed himself a moment of respite. He accepted an invitation to Ford's Theater, where the comedy Our American Cousin promised laughter after years of sorrow. He arrived with his wife, Mary, and 2 guests. The presidential party took their seats in the decorated box above the stage, draped with American flags. Lincoln was smiling that night, more relaxed than those who had seen him in months could remember. As the play unfolded, the crowd roared with laughter, unaware that history was shifting in the shadows. John Wilkes Booth, familiar with every corner of the theater, moved with calculated ease. He slipped into the building unnoticed, his actor's face blending with the backstage bustle. Concealed under his coat was a single-shot Derringer pistol and a hunting knife. Booth's plan was simple. Wait for the right moment, when the audience's laughter would mask the sound of his crime. At approximately 10:15 p.m., the cue arrived. On stage, an actor delivered a line guaranteed to draw raucous laughter. The crowd erupted. In that instant, Booth opened the door to the presidential box. Lincoln sat unaware, his eyes fixed on the play. The assassin raised the Derringer. With a single squeeze of the trigger, the theater transformed into a crucible of chaos. The shot echoed like thunder, mingling with the audience's laughter to create a sound that would haunt American memory forever. Mary Lincoln screamed. The president slumped forward, a dark wound in his head. The joyous theater became a scene of terror as Booth brandished his knife, slashed at a defender, and prepared to make his dramatic escape. For Lincoln, the night had begun in peace, in laughter, in a rare moment of ease. It now descended into darkness, marking the final act of his life, and the most infamous performance Ford's Theater would ever host. The sound of the gunshot pierced through Ford's Theater, cutting laughter into silence. In that instant, time itself seemed to shatter. Abraham Lincoln, the man who had carried the weight of a divided nation, slumped forward in his seat. The bullet had entered the back of his head, tearing a path through destiny itself. Mary Lincoln let out a scream that echoed across the theater. Her husband's body collapsed into her arms, his tall frame suddenly fragile, suddenly mortal. Panic spread among the crowd. Some thought it part of the play. Others realized with horror that the President of the United States had just been struck down before their very eyes. Booth leapt into motion. Drawing his knife, he slashed Major Henry Rathbone, who tried to stop him. Blood spilled in the struggle, but Booth broke free and vaulted over the railing of the presidential box. His boot snagged on the draped flag, snapping his leg as he landed on the stage. Yet even injured, he rose tall, his actor's voice booming into the stunned silence. Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. To Booth, it was a triumphant declaration. To the audience, it was the cry of a murderer. He limped across the stage, brandishing his knife, and disappeared into the night. Behind him, chaos erupted. Soldiers scrambled toward the president's box. Doctors were summoned from the audience. People sobbed, prayed, and shouted as the theater dissolved into pandemonium. Lincoln lay unconscious, breathing faintly, his life suspended by the thinnest thread. The laughter of moments before had been replaced by a grief so raw, it felt as though the nation itself had been shot through the heart. That single bullet had not only struck a man, it had pierced the soul of a country struggling to heal. They carried Abraham Lincoln from the theater, across the street, and into the modest Peterson house. There, in a narrow back bedroom, the president was laid on a bed too small for his tall frame. His legs had to be angled to fit. The room filled with doctors, cabinet members, and military officers, all moving with frantic urgency yet helpless against the wound. Lincoln never regained consciousness. His breathing came shallow, irregular, each gasp a reminder of the fragile line between life and death. Mary Lincoln, inconsolable, was led away in tears. Robert Lincoln, his son, stood vigil in silence, his face hardened by grief. Through the long night, physicians tried everything they could, probing the wound, applying compresses, but the damage was beyond repair. The bullet had done its work. The only thing left was to watch the inevitable unfold. Outside, crowds gathered in the cold April night. They waited in silence, eyes fixed on the windows, praying for a miracle that would not come. Inside, the air was thick with sorrow. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton kept order, his stern face masking the ache of loss. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, Lincoln drew his final breath. Stanton broke the silence with words that carried the weight of history. Now he belongs to the ages. With those words, the room itself seemed to freeze. The president was gone. The man who had held the Union together, who had freed millions from bondage, who had spoken of malice toward none and charity for all, had been silenced by a single act of hatred. News spread quickly. Bells tolled. Newspapers rushed to print. Across the nation, a wave of grief swept from city streets to rural farms. For many, it felt as though a father had died. For others, it was the cruelest irony, that peace had finally arrived, only to be met with tragedy. The United States had lost not only its leader, but its moral compass. Lincoln's death was more than the end of a life. It was the fracture of hope at the very moment when healing had begun. The news of Lincoln's death spread with the speed of fire across a dry plain. In Washington, church bells tolled in grief. In New York, crowds poured into the streets, their faces streaked with tears. Across the rural heartland, farmers stopped their plows and wept openly in the fields. It was as if the very earth of America had absorbed the wound. For millions of newly freed men and women, Lincoln's death was personal. They called him Father Abraham, the man who had broken the chains of slavery. In black churches, congregations lifted their voices in sorrow and prayer, mourning the loss of the leader who had promised them freedom. To them, his assassination felt like betrayal from heaven itself. The funeral became a national pilgrimage. Lincoln's body lay in state at the Capitol, where thousands filed past in silence. His coffin was then placed on a funeral train that wound its way through city after city, retracing the path he'd once taken to Washington as president-elect. In every town, crowds lined the tracks. Some stood in solemn silence, others sobbed, some sang hymns. It was not only a farewell, it was a binding together of grief. Children were lifted onto shoulders to glimpse the passing train. Soldiers stood at attention, rifles reversed in mourning. Ordinary men and women left flowers, wreaths, and handwritten notes, tokens of affection for a leader who had become, in death, more beloved than ever. The mourning was not confined to the Union. Even in parts of the defeated South, people grieved, realizing that Lincoln might have been their best hope for reconciliation. His absence left a void that would soon be filled by harsher, more vengeful policies. For weeks, the nation existed in a fog of sorrow. Newspapers called it the darkest hour in American history. And in truth, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln was not just the killing of a president. It was the attempted murder of the country's fragile hope for healing. Abraham Lincoln's life ended in violence, but his legacy refused to die. From the log cabin of his birth to the White House of his destiny, his journey came to embody the American promise that greatness could rise from the humblest of beginnings. His words, his deeds, and his sacrifice became woven into the nation's very identity. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and his defense of the Union reshaped the moral foundation of the United States. He had preserved the Republic at its breaking point and redefined freedom itself. For millions, he was not merely a president, but a symbol, a reminder that courage and conscience could guide a nation through its darkest night. Generations of leaders, thinkers, and ordinary citizens would look back to him for inspiration. Martin Luther King Jr. would invoke his memory at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Writers and philosophers across the world would cite him as proof that democracy could endure even under fire. His life and death became not only American history but universal history. And yet, his legacy was paradoxical. The very city that condemned him to death in the theater also enshrined him in marble. The man who faced scorn in life was immortalized in death. His assassination turned him into a martyr, ensuring that his ideals would echo louder than his voice ever could. Lincoln himself once said, "The ballot is stronger than the bullet." Ironically, it was a bullet that ended his life. But it was the ballot, the principles of democracy he defended, that carried his spirit forward. Today, his image gazes from currency, his words are etched into stone, and his memory stands as a guardian of the Republic. But his true legacy is not in monuments or speeches. It is in the enduring struggle for justice, equality, and unity that his life embodied. Abraham Lincoln belongs not only to the ages, as Stanton declared, but to every generation that dares to believe in freedom. His death shook the United States, but his legacy continues to steady it, whispering across time that the fight for liberty is never finished.